Okay. Welcome, everyone, to the third workshop on entrepreneurial finance and innovation lecture series. I'm happy to introduce Song Ma, assistant professor of finance at Yale University, the business school there, who works, of course, in entrepreneurship and innovation. And in particular, he works in the areas he'll be talking about today, the interactions between startups and incumbents. Before we get started and I hand it off to Song, let me just get a kind of ground rules going. So you can request to be unmuted. The way we're going to do the format here is if you have a question, particularly a clarifying question, feel free to raise your hand or preferably use the chat window. I'll be here monitoring the chat. Think of this as a lecture where Song can answer clarifying questions. But if you have big, deep questions, he'll stay around to the end of the lecture to answer those types of questions. So raise your hand. I can unmute you if it's a clarifying question, or use the chat, and I'll use that as a sort of guide whether I should stop Song in his tracks and ask the question. I think that's everything. Thanks again for coming. I'm going to hand it off to Song. Yeah.
Can you see the share screen? All right.
Yes, looks
okay,
good.
Perfect. First of all, I'm Song. I'm from Yale University, and I'm going to talk about the interactions between startups and incumbents. Before starting, I do want to thank everyone for joining, and I hope you are all well and healthy. And I do have a lot of slides today, and you will see why very quickly, because, I mean, essentially, when they asked me to do this topic, I thought, oh, that's deep in my heart. I really wanted to do it. But gradually, I realized the topic will explode. And there are so many good papers and so many interesting topics that I wanted to review. And essentially, I did a lot of cutting, but still, there are a lot of things that we need to do. And therefore, I apologize if I do not have time to fully answer your deep questions, but please use the chat window or anything that Mike just mentioned. And also, I'm also happy to discuss further through private communications, like my email is song.ma@yale.edu, and feel free to draw me an email, and I'm happy to talk about this topic as we go. So let me jump right in. So I'm going to start by motivating young firms and startups are very important, okay? Here I listed two firms that are surprisingly important during my quarantine period, right? The first one is Whole Foods. The other one is Ben & Jerry, okay? If you actually look at my ice cream consumption in those days, you will know what I'm talking about. And these are their founders fondly memorizing how they're doing during their young period and how much fun things that they did and so on, okay? So it's generally because we're here, I believe that people agree that young firms are important and fun. And therefore, a lot of entrepreneurship studies focus on questions about startups. What motivates people to become entrepreneurs? What kind of constraints do startups face? Do they face financial, talent, regulatory, and so on and so forth type of constraint? And we also ask, how do startups obtain financing and how useful are VCs and all sorts of things, okay? I think those questions are surprisingly important, and also they are very, very deep in our literature. And what I am going to do in terms of motivating my lecture today is to start from this but. What is this but about? Startups do not live in vacuum, okay? As soon as they enter the economy, they start to interact with each other, and more importantly, perhaps they start to interact with incumbents. Let me tell you what I mean by here, okay? So imagine a newborn baby enter the world. I guess the first thing that they realize is that there are a lot of big people who look a lot more mature and big around them, okay? And certainly they will have a lot of fond memories with those incumbents, okay? Their parents, nurses, and the doctors, and so on and so forth. But gradually, as what I am experiencing now as a parent, they frustrate each other as well, okay? And of course, I'm not going to really kind of make this a parenting lecture. Let me tell you how it shows up, okay? In the economic news, when we talk about startups, what are we really talking about? What are incumbents startup interactions how do they show up in the everyday economic activities that we deal with? These are just some news that I just randomly clipped in the past month or so as I was preparing this lecture, okay? And what you can see are things like this. Big tech set up kill zone for industry upstarts. Okay, clearly they're not happy with each other. Okay, and also there are happy relationships that are happening there. For example, how partnering with startup is helping incumbents grow, and Ford and GM mitigates EV electric vehicle development risk by partnering with startups. Okay, so clearly in some domains they're working together, and also there are some interesting flows between startups and incumbents. Here are some more headlines in the news. For example, Apple reportedly exploring acqui-hires of self-driving startups. Okay, and 6 reasons people leave big companies to join startups, and so on. Those are the type of news that are around us, okay, every day, which shows that even though startups are very important as a research object, but we also need to know during their day-to-day life, what they need to do is to interact with incumbents. Okay, those interactions could be multidimensional, could be very complicated, and those are the type of things that we're going to talk about today. So the central question of today's talk is the following. We're going to try to understand how do startups and incumbents interact with each other and why. Okay, and in this question, I need to define 2 things. Okay, because if I don't define it properly, the lecture will really kind of become very unorganized. I do want to define first what I mean by interaction. Okay, by interaction, I mean how one's presence affect the other's behaviors. Okay, basically, I want to understand how the presence or actions of startups could affect the behaviors of incumbents or vice versa. Okay, and this kind of interactions could be very explicit. That is direct engagement, as we will see. For example, if they form certain type of alliances together, those are the type of direct engagement that we can talk about. But also there are more subtle and indirect influence one exert on the other. For example, knowledge spillover or labor market computation. Those things are not direct engagement, but the presence and actions of one party really affect the behaviors of the other. These are also under the umbrella of today's topic, even though I will spend more time on the explicit and direct engagement a lot more. Okay. The second thing I want to define is the scope of the interactions. As you can see from all those news, okay, that the news headlines, the titles, and so on, there are so many things that could happen in the interactions between startup and incumbents, okay? Like this could be innovation, labor, and so on. So what I am going to, how I'm going to spend my time is that I am going to spend the most of my, like maybe half of my time on innovation, because I think that is the central dimension that people care about, and actually that motivates a lot of the later dimensions that we will talk about. But beyond innovation, we will also talk about interactions in other things. For example, labor, financing, physical capital, and all those interactions in labor market, financial market, and physical capital market, and maybe product market are also going to be covered in today's talk. Okay, so before going into the detail, we know the question now. Let me put 3 caveats here. Therefore, we know like what you really can take away from this talk. The first one that I want to mention is like the interactions between startups and incumbents by itself is not what I call a well-defined literature. If you think about the 2 wonderful lectures that we heard in the past 2 months, the first one by gender, race, and entrepreneurship by Mike, and also the risk and the return of private equity, those are very well-defined literature. They have a central question, and they're going to deal with that through different kind of generations of research and so on. I view what I am talking about here is more of a view of organizing a lot of seemingly unrelated topics. Okay, and basically there are some research in different fields that briefly touched on this topic, but they didn't motivate this way. And I am basically helped to organize what all those literature is talking about with respect to this specific lens, which is how startups and incumbents interact with each other. That's the first caveat. The second caveat is for those people who are very deep into the entrepreneurship literature, that we know that the definition of startup is actually a little bit ambiguous, and also it's different from paper to paper. I'm not going to be very explicitly distinguish small versus young firms in this talk. They share some of the key properties for the purpose of this talk. And to be quite honest, the law literature is just not there yet in order to help us distinguish the two very properly in this specific topic. Okay. The third caveat is that I might have missed a lot of good papers. Therefore, if you feel like I missed important ones, please feel free to send to me. And also, some of the papers I left out because I think they're just too famous. Everybody knows that. Okay. Take notes. This is the nicest way you actually can defend that you missed one citation in your thing because you think they are too famous. Okay, and also what I'm going to talk about is certainly limited by my knowledge and the 75 minutes time limits. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a preparation stage. That is, I'm going to try to build a world for our discussion with a startup, with an incumbents. And we're going to say what they are. We're going to make assumptions about how they look. And that's going to be the base. If you think about this, this is going to be a theoretical assumption stage of what we're going to talk about. And then the majority of the time will be spent on the key findings and the key economics. We're going to talk through innovation, labor, capital, financing, and so on. And then I'm going to also hopefully spend a few minutes on my thoughts on where this agenda is going. So the preparation stage. Again, because there are so many moving pieces that could potentially happen in this talk, therefore, let me try to get you to think through the following thought experiment. We're going to refer back to this example again and again and again. Okay, and hopefully you will take this as example to intuitively think about all the things that we're going to talk about. Let's think about two companies. Okay, the first company is this upstarting entrepreneurial company called Song's Ice Cream. Okay, and there's this guy named Song, like me, who started this ice cream shop. Okay, this is the startup, and we're going to talk about how the startups, like what kind of properties those startups have in a minute. And then we also have this big food group called Carol and Chloe's, or I'm going to refer as CNC. And the reason I picked those names, those are my two daughters, okay? And clearly they dominate me in my household, therefore I'm going to design them as the big firms, okay, in this economy. We're going to talk about Song's Ice Cream and CNC Group, which is a food group that do ice cream, but potentially other things as well, okay? And then what are some important properties that we need to assume in order to generate a lot of the results that are already in the literature? Some of them are incredibly well accepted, even though that we don't really have direct evidence, but I'm going to take them as given, okay? Let me review them one by one and just to know what kind of things we're assuming about each type of firms. So for the startup, which is Song's Ice Cream here, we're going to first say startups are more financially constrained than incumbents. This is very well documented in the literature. One of the, there are just so many seminal papers that says startups are more financially constrained than incumbents on average. Firm age and size are the two dominant factor in determining financial constraint, okay? And then the second assumption we're going to assume is startups are more likely to produce disruptive innovation. I guess starting from the Schumpeterian view of the world, this is something that we have been assuming about entrepreneurship. I mean, to really empirically document these facts is actually very difficult, but I think I'm just going to take this assumption as given for now that will just facilitate some of our discussions going forward, because indeed, a lot of evidence are actually consistent with this assumption being true in the literature. And then the third assumption, which is a more modern one, that especially in the past 15 years or so, that is startups are more experimental and uncertain. Okay, that I'm not going to differentiate between uncertainty and risks and so on and so forth, but in some ways, just in your mind, think entrepreneurial companies are more experimental and uncertainty. For example, Song's ice cream could possibly create 5 very weird flavors of ice cream just to experiment. And also I might actually move around to different blocks and to different neighborhoods to sell ice cream and so on. Okay, they're just more experimental, uncertain, and maybe the more likely actually to die from the business perspective. Okay, so I'm going to assume startup have those properties. And then by definition, incumbents will have the following 2 properties, which are also very, very simple. The first one is incumbents already own some market power to some extent. Okay, I don't think we can debate about this, because the fact that you are an incumbent, at least the incumbents that we care about in talking here, you have some market power, you have some market shares, and also incumbents have more resources. Those resources, I want to highlight that they include, okay, the financial resources that we talk about here, okay, but also some other resources like marketing, knowledge, reputation, and so on and so forth. These are just the things that incumbents accumulated over the years when they do their business. Okay, so I want you to actually look at those 5 assumptions again, okay, because for each of the discussion, we actually will refer back to these 5 assumptions to see each of them plays what kind of roles when we are thinking about the interactions between them. A1 is startup are more financially constrained. A2, startups are more likely to produce disruptive innovation. A3 is startups more experimental and uncertain. And for incumbents, we're talking about incumbents already own to some extent the market power. And A5, which is incumbents have more resources, not only financial, but also marketing, knowledge, reputation, regulatory capital, and so on and so forth. Okay? So just to vaguely think about why do startups and incumbents interact in this world, is because they have a common goal, but they have a different endowment and constraints. Okay, they have the common goal of to maximizing their own profit, but they have differences in their endowed resources. Okay, and also they have different constraints in terms of financial and other resources as well. So from a very naive and vague perspective, startup will want to collect resources to survive, to grow themselves to bigger and faster companies, while incumbents will want to protect their existing resources, benefit from startup innovation, and potentially deter startup entrant. Okay, those 5 assumptions in the previous slides can vaguely already let us think startups would want to do different things than incumbents. And because those resources could be complementary to each other, there could be a moving force to make them to actually start talking and interact. Okay, for now, those discussions are very vague, okay, but I just want to get this idea out there, okay, to kind of warm up you to think about how they would interact with each other, okay, and things will be much clearer as we move into specific topics, okay. So those are the assumptions that we're going to make about Song's ice cream and CNC group, okay? Now we're going into how those assumptions about those companies, okay, those startups and incumbents will actually motivate them to interact across different dimensions of their business activities, okay? We're going to start from innovation, okay? I'm going to now add innovation into this setting. And then we're going to think about the following case. That is, we're going to imagine Song's ice cream, okay, is developing a recipe for what we call the 0-calorie ice cream that actually tastes very good, okay? First of all, I don't know whether there are 0-calorie ice cream out there. If there are, please send me an email. I think that will be much appreciated. And but let's just assume that Song's ice cream is developing a recipe for 0-calorie ice cream that actually tastes very good. Okay, that actually tastes very good. And the traditional view or the simple narrative, okay, to think about how those innovations from the startup, okay, affect the economy and affect incumbents would be the following. That is, the startup will creatively disrupt the incumbents in the process. They will come in with this great recipe. They're going to replace the incumbents. They're going to be the new leaders, and so on and so forth. This is the simple narrative when a lot of traditional papers and traditional views think about entrepreneurial innovation. But I want to argue that, in fact, in this practice, there are a ton of interaction in this process, and it's optimal for both parties to actually interact in this process to actually harvest the benefit of this new innovation. And then let's think about what they can do. With the following assumptions here, I kind of grayed out these assumptions that we don't need, okay? The assumptions we don't need, and highlighted the ones that are important for us to think about interactions in innovation. Startup are financially constrained, okay? I'm going to read them out again. Startups are financially constrained than incumbents. Incumbents have more resources, okay? And those resources not only are financial, but also marketing, reputation, knowledge, production, and all those different things, okay? And startups are more likely to produce disruptive innovation. This is already kind of assumed in this case. How actually can they form direct innovation interactions? I'm going to talk about 3 different forms of potential interactions between those 2 sectors. The first one is alliances, okay? Alliances is a formal co-development effort that are formed between a startup and incumbents. And the second is trading, okay? That is the trading of innovation assets, for example, a patent or a recipe, and so on. Those trading could happen in the form of licensing. That is, Song's Ice Cream will license to CNC Group, or I can sell my recipe to them. Okay, I'm going to go into details of them specifically later. And there are also one that is direct competition. That is, the interaction could take a more aggressive form. That is, the incumbents could come in and start to compete with the the startup, in order to deter startup entry. Okay, let's go into specific ones to say what I mean and what are the economic rationales behind each type of interactions that we are talking here. Okay, the first one is alliances. What is alliance? Strategic alliance is an arrangement between 2 companies to undertake a mutually beneficial project while each retain its independence. Okay, to use the language that we have in this example, that is, Song's Ice Cream, the small startup, okay, could contribute R&D resources, while CNC Group could contribute to the alliances with marketing and financing resources. And then the joint effort in developing this recipe, commercializing it, take it to the market, sell them to profit, and share all those profits. Okay, so this is what strategic alliances actually can do for you in order for the startups, okay, to develop their innovation faster, while for the incumbents to also benefit from this kind of startup innovation. There are several important papers, both empirically and theoretically, that think about how to rationalize the existence and the design of a strategic alliances contract, okay, in order for those kind of relationship to be stable, as well as to be efficient in incentivizing innovative effort from the startups, as well as the contribution from the incumbent firms. And then the first line of thinking in this kind of papers is what I think as a combo. Okay, I always think of those 2 papers as a pair. Actually, the second view is also a pair of papers. So the first pair of papers is Aghion, Tirole, 1994, and Lerner and Murders, 1998. And what they did is basically they use an incomplete contract framework, and then they argue that strategic alliances, okay, by keeping the development effort outside, okay, of the big firms, and provide incentives for the incumbents, okay, specifically the research intensive startups to pay effort and avoid underinvestment problem. But how much control rights and how they're going to split their revenue is going to be dependent on the relative strength and importance of their wedges in their research capability and financial resources. Basically, what this argument is saying is that by not acquiring all those Song's ice cream and keeping it in the strategic alliances and being independent, that will actually make Song's ice cream, like myself, to more likely to pay more effort because I am still owning my firm. I'm not working for a big company and I'm still owning the equity shares. At the same time, how much I can benefit from them will depend on how much I depend on the financial resources and other resources from the incumbents, okay? And the Lerner and Mergers 1998 have a textbook test of this theory, okay? I really like this paper because I think they follow the theory very clearly and use the data very creatively. They use both case study as well as empirical analysis on hundreds of very detailed strategic alliances contracts. And what they did is that they code the detailed empirical contract design of alliances, and they find wedges, basically the differences in the startup incumbent financial resources affect the design of this alliances contract. That is, it is indeed financial constrained entrepreneurs are going out to this incumbents in order to obtain their support, and the bargaining power story matters there. They did not find evidence, though, that uncertainty and riskiness of the disruptive innovation matter, okay? The second line of thinking about strategic alliances is what I think as a pair, okay? It's Stein 1997 and Robinson 2008. What they did, okay, is they provide an alternative rationale for alliances through the key assumption that certain investment contracts are only enforceable between firms, but not internally. What it means is that even though when CNC group wants to develop their 0-calorie ice cream, okay, they will not be able to provide enough incentive to their internal employees, okay, because they know their headquarters are picking the winners, are going to reward the ones who actually show results, are not going to tolerate enough risks, and so on and so forth. Well, if we keep those development relationships outside the boundary of the firm through strategic alliances, that will be easier, okay? And Robinson 2008 have an empirical test on this using large sample alliances from STC Platinum and find supporting evidence to this conjecture that the very risky, very disruptive innovation are more likely to be developed in the strategic alliances. Why? Because that can align the incentives for the startups as well as leveraging on the resources of the incumbents, okay? Do strategic alliances produce results, or do they matter for the economy? And the answer seemed to be yes, okay? In the 2013 paper, the authors find alliances activities lead startups to enter more more alliances. Sorry, this is a typo here, in the future, but less VC investment. And the idea is alliances help address information asymmetry, but introduce conflicts of interest with future investors. And in a more recent paper, Lee, Chiu, and Wang, 2019, find that firms entering strategic alliances pool resources and share knowledges, and this lead to more higher quality and more explorative patent production for the economy, okay? So strategic alliances is in development. Basically, they are in the development process, is an in development alliances of their resources with the hope to actually combine their resources and obtain better results for both the startups as well as the incumbents, okay? So there are the second way of thinking about this innovation relation between startups and incumbents, that is through patent licensing, okay? A patent license agreement here is a contract between a patent owner and a licensee that defines the terms under which the license may make, sell, and use the patented innovation. And the agreement also provides how royalty will be paid to a patent owner, okay? The difference between license and alliances, the key one is their timing, okay? License happens after some innovation is already developed, and now they're at the commercialization stage, and they're basically trying to harvest the benefit of them. Let me actually show you how this thing really works. Again, using this ice cream example, assume, okay, I successfully developed 0-calorie ice cream, okay? I'm very happy with that, and having them 3 times a day. And what the license does is that the small company will provide the right to use certain patents, okay, to the incumbents like the CNC group. And in return for that right to use, the CNC group will return money, which is the royalty, okay, to the startup company, okay? There is a whole literature called The Market for Technology, okay, that specifically talks about this licensing design and how this market will function. And I am not the best person, and I have very limited time to talk about all those things. Therefore, I am not going to talk about the specific literature. Instead, I'm only giving you 2 of my favorite references in this literature. One is Ashish Arora and his co-authors. It's a book in 2001, and Gens and Stern 2003, okay? But I do want to give you something, because I'm making the assumption that a lot of the audience here are from either finance or economic or strategy background, okay? And I think licensing data is incredibly difficult to get, okay? And I would like to provide a not so well-known licensing data source for you if you actually know how financial reporting works. That is, actually SEC filings has a lot of licensing agreements that are not really well studied yet. What do I mean by that? That is, when either incumbents or especially incumbents, when they sign a material contract, which is the contract that you can roughly think as important for the business, what they need to do is that they're going to send off a either one-time reporting or a regular reporting like 10K and TQ to the SEC to report the existence and sometimes even the detailed terms of those licensing agreement. For example, yesterday, I basically just went on the ICC website and then just to look at Pfizer. And there are tons of licensing agreement that happens to Pfizer with other companies, okay? And they're incredibly detailed, okay? Sometimes they're like tens of pages long. And like, for example, it starts from the licensing agreement, start from the parties, start from the year, start from the underlying assets. Sometimes the detailed terms are redacted, basically they are hidden, but a lot of the times they are actually made available. Therefore, for those of you who are interested in thinking about this, I guess the best way to think about it is to read the licensing papers. This is an incredibly interesting literature. And also think about how to leverage the financing reporting data, which also, in a methodological perspective, are also very well studied. So there's going to be some easy time for you, perhaps, to get a hold of some detailed data in here. So this is licensing. And another extreme of interactions, okay, which actually already is part of the acquisition, if you want to think about it that way, is patent trading and reallocation, okay? Patent trading is the extreme end of innovation interactions, in which case the patent from one firm is completely transferred to the other, okay? And there are good data on this topic, which is the USPTO patent assignment data, okay? What happens is that if one firm buys the patent from the other, the patent rights will be recorded a transfer in the USPTO, and the USPTO now actually has a good data source for that for you to track, okay? This is also something that is not very well studied yet, and I think there are a lot of interesting research opportunities by leveraging this already well-organized data in USPTO, okay? And the difference between patent trading and licensing is about the ownership design, okay? In licensing, the original developer, like myself, who owns that 0-calorie ice cream recipe, are still going to own that patent. I only granted the right of use to the licensee, and for patent trading, on the other hand, is a full transfer of patent rights. I'm basically selling my patents to those people, okay? I sell my patents to those people. Surprisingly, patent trading is very, very common, okay? This is something that we didn't know before until those 2 papers that came out, okay? Those 2 papers that came out. Some of them are through acquisitions, certainly, but some of them are actually only patents in that transaction. That is, the firm boundary didn't merge with each other. It's only the patents that got transacted between them. On average, 16% of the US PTO patents are traded. And if you only look at domestic patents in the US, domestic to the US, the trading frequency is almost like 20%, okay? And on average, the trading age is very young. That is about 5.5 years old. That is, a lot of innovation are traded like at the very early stage of their patent life, okay? Now then you would ask, okay, what's the role of small versus big firm or young versus old firm in this process? This is a more recent paper by Figueroa and Serrano, 2019. And what they find, they specifically look at the problem of patent flow between small and big firms. That is, the patent flow from ice cream shops like mine to a big food group. What they find is like small firm patents are 70% more likely to be treated, even conditional on survival. Okay, even conditional on survival. This is not like the startup just died and therefore like they transfer their patents. No, 70% more likely to be treated from small firms, and the frequency of small selling to big is 5 times more likely than a big firm selling to small firms. Okay, what is the rationale behind that? Is the idea is, for a small ice cream stand like mine, okay, even I have a very good idea, even I have a good idea and good recipe, it's so hard for me to scale it up efficiently and really benefit from this. As soon as CNC give me a good offer to buy them out and then immediately push them to the market using their abundant marketing financial resources, it's a good deal for me. Therefore, I just sell my patents to some of them. Okay, to sell my patents to them and get the benefit, at least some of them. Okay, so basically, what I try to say here, that patent transaction is another important dimension of innovation interactions. When the startups actually create something that is very good, it's not like I can just only replace the incumbents. There are a lot of detailed interactions that could happen there. So all those findings are based on those 3 assumptions that we have here. Startups are more financial constrained even though they have disruptive innovation. Incumbents have more resources like marketing, knowledge, and reputation. Therefore, they can effectively scale and broad up all those innovation. Now, let's actually add another assumption into this place, which is incumbents actually already own, to some extent, the market power. Okay, it's not a fully competitive market. And the incumbents actually have a lot of incentives, okay, to protect their existing product and protect their existing market power, okay, through their interactions in the innovation market, okay? What kind of new implications or new findings once we acknowledge that they actually have market power and have the incentive to do anti-competitive behaviors? Here's the paper that is actually about acquisitions, okay? This is one of my papers with my co-authors, Colleen Cunningham and Florian Ederer. And we document this fact called killer acquisitions. And what happens is that an incumbent firm may acquire an innovative target, okay? CNC could acquire me and terminate the development of the target's innovations to preempt future competition, okay? Basically, I know someone who already developed who is developing something that is very interesting and could be potentially competitive and hurt my market revenue. I want to protect my market share by acquiring them and just shelve their product. Okay. The key insights of the paper is that for incumbents with the market power, they're incentivized to protect their market share and profit by paying a good price to acquire promising innovation, but forego costly and uncertain development. Okay, I acquire you, I don't need to develop you because I already own the market share. I don't need to worry about other people competing with me after I acquire you. Okay, the data sources for this paper is Pharma Project, Trial Trove, and acquisition data, which could be potentially useful for a lot of innovation studies that you might be interested in doing. And the key test that we find is that acquisitions of overlapping, basically the pure substitute projects by an incumbents often lead to the termination of the target startup projects. Okay, and these acquisitions, the killer acquisitions, are often performed by flying under the FTC scrutiny. That is the HSR threshold that they do. Therefore, like the FTC sometimes don't even review their acquisition deals. Okay, there are also some interesting reading by Woman, 2019 AER Insights. Okay, this is another companion paper that also dominated, that also shows those kind of acquisitions. Okay, and isn't that a good thing that the startups can actually obtain high value acquisitions, even though this is anti-competitive? This could be the case. Philip and Zhidanov, 2013 at the RFS, suggest this might be the case, but we argue that this could be socially costly. But a very, very interesting paper, okay, that actually is going to also, if I look at the schedule, is actually next week's WEFI workshop, is by Kamapali, Raghuram, and Luigi Zingales, 2020. The paper is called Kill Zone. Basically, they argue that the existence of a powerful incumbents introduce barriers to a startup's customer acquisition and technological adoption, which in turn affects entrepreneurial financing. Okay, I'm going to use the ice cream shop to actually articulate this idea a little bit. Therefore, like you know what this kill zone is really about. This it basically means, okay, if people know as a small ice cream shop, they're going to come and acquire me and potentially terminate my product, okay, like through a killer acquisition and so on and so forth. As a customer, I'm less willing to come to buy your product because the customer service is going to be bad. If I sign up for a subscription, you're not going to deliver them, and so on and so forth, okay? Therefore, it makes the starting up process a lot more difficult compared to a case where the incumbents are not exerting their market power, okay? So overall, I think if you introduce market power into this innovation discussion, you actually see a lot of antitrust discussions. This is a Congress report that came out last week, I think. And basically they're claiming Amazon and those big four are conducting anti-competitive behaviors to actually hurt US innovation and the small businesses, okay? So I think this is also a potentially interesting area to really do that and do good research. So just to recap on the innovation interactions, we start from the narrative that startups produce disruptive innovation to replace incumbents. And I basically want to argue that we should consider this with the potential active interactions between the two sectors. Those interactions are largely driven by the wedges of their innovation capability and their financial and other resources, okay? And they could take different forms: alliances, licensing, trading, acquisitions, and so on and so forth. And innovation interactions is the central piece that drives some other dimensions, okay? And I'm also omitting some interesting papers that document indirect innovation interactions, for example, knowledge spillover and so on, okay? I still think innovation interaction is a key area when we think about the interactions between startups and incumbents, okay? But this is the central piece. Now let's branch out a little bit and try to think about, well, how other dimensions could also interact with as well. I'm going to now move on to think about the financing relation, okay? By financing relation, I mean, their interaction is through a financial arrangement. In the innovation section, most of the transactions actually involve financial transactions as well. For example, in strategic alliances, it involves capital contribution from the large firms to that alliance's entity. In the licensing agreement, they need to pay royalty to the incumbent, to the startup firms. But here, I want to consider deals where the major component is actually a financial one, okay? And then the question is, why their differences in their financial constraint and resources could actually drive financing arrangement going either way. That is, there could be cases that incumbents finance startups. Actually, there also are going to be cases, surprisingly, startups financing the incumbents, okay? And we're going to talk about such deals. And we actually need only one very simple assumption here, okay, for the beginning of this talk, for the beginning of this financing interaction. That is, startups are more financially constrained. We briefly perhaps need some discussion about the disruptive innovation one, but that's not going to be at the center of this. So in what kind of ways incumbents finance startups? This is very natural that incumbents could invest in startups, okay? The most prominent type of such interactions or financial arrangement is through corporate venture capital. Imagine CNC Group creates a corporate VC group called CNC Venture to invest in startups like mine, okay? So the way that corporate VC works is that a parent firm creates a corporate VC division, and the corporate VC, for example, CNC Group will create a VC. They're going to make investment in the startups like Song's Ice Cream, okay? Let's think about a little bit about the difference between CVC and alliances, and why do I call alliances a innovation relationship and CVC more of an investment or financing relationship. For alliances, it is very focused. It often has a very specific development goal in mind. It has clear complementarity, firms pooling resources together in order to develop certain product. And also there is a clear control rights delineation by both parties to talk about in each steps of innovation development, who owns what rights, and in the end, who owns the end product, okay? Therefore, the central piece of that discussion is about how that innovation works or how that product works. CVC is not really that case. It is a very weak form of interaction, okay? It is a very weak form of interaction. And sometimes as I started looking at this, I actually have a paper on this, I find that to be puzzling why this thing even existed. And I think people still are debating about the optimality of this organizational form. And what you see is that incumbents invest in a wide range of early stage startups. They have very loose control, okay, from the incumbents' perspective. They do not often have a contracted goal of development of any specific product, and they often do not have very strong control as well. And for the startups, they also have a clear alternative from their perspective. Why do I want the big giants incumbents to come and invest in me if I actually have alternative resources like venture capitalists or other financing resources? Why do I form this very weak financial link without contracted goals? And not only that this thing existed, this thing is booming, okay? The CVC is booming. If you look at both the number of deals that involve CVC investment and the total shares or proportion of total US CVC in the total VC market, you can see roughly 16 or 17% of the deals that involve a CVC. And if you look at the deal amount, the CVC covered ones are actually more than half of them. So basically there are a lot of CVC investment that is around, and a lot of big firms that you think about in the economy actually have those kind of weak interactions with their with the startup entity, okay? Why do incumbents ever want to do this? Okay, why do they actually want to go out and then do this kind of very weak form of financial investment. Here's a paper that I have that just came out this year using CVC initiation. Basically, I mainly focus on the initiation, basically the starting of a CVC program of an incumbent firm, and also follow through their investment and termination decisions for the past 30 years. And I track how their internal innovation productivity affect their decision to go out and to invest in startups. And I argue that CVC is used to fix weaknesses inside the internal internal innovation efforts, and they do CVC with the hope to learn innovation knowledge from the startups. Honestly, what this paper really says is that those incumbent firms don't really know what they should do. Okay, they are lagging in the innovation curve. Okay, their technology have become more obsolescent. Therefore, they go out to invest in dozens of small businesses to help find their path going forward. And CVC are often initiated following innovation deteriorations or technological obsolescence of their internal knowledge stock. They make strategic investment and often terminate it after regaining internal innovation. Okay. So this is, okay, somehow echoing the theme that Josh Lerner articulated in the 2012 book named The Architecture of Innovation. It argues that CVC, by using this loose form to incentivize entrepreneurs, but also transfer knowledge to the startup, could be the best way to incentivize innovation in the current economy because it combines creativity, knowledge, and the risk tolerance and the long-termism of VCs. But it also faces challenges because a lot of people consider CVC, which is corporate incumbents making investment in startup, could be a very dumb decision. Okay, CVC investors are not incentivized well compared to other venture capitalists. And also the relation between a CVC division and their parent organization is also too complicated, okay, to make their relationship sometimes very awkward. A lot of the terminations are actually led by that. But if you look at the good evidence on whether CVC works, I think the answer seems to be yes, okay, even though they face all those challenges. I recommend those of you who are interested in this specific topic to look at Gary Dushnitsky and Mike Linnick's several series papers between 2012 to 2015. I'm only referring two of them here, okay? And what they find is that CVCs with a clear strategic goal, as long as they know what they want to gather information about, that is actually going to create a lot of firm value for the incumbent firm, for the parent firm. And also the effectiveness of the CVC investment, it hinges on the financial health of the company and the ability for them to absorb good innovation knowledge from outside, from the startups, okay? So now we kind of deal a little bit with the incumbents problem. Why do I even want to do something like that? The startups problem is also challenging, okay? Why do I want to accept CVC money given that we have potentially other money out there, okay? Like VCs and so on. Why startups are willing to take CVC money? Hellmann 2002 is one of the first papers that really theoretically investigates the problem. And what he argues is that when the complementarity is high, okay, that will overcome my hesitation as a startup to actually worry about taking the money from the CVC, because taking complementarity assets from CVC, not only financial, but also the marketing resources and so on, could be very beneficial to me. And Matthews 2006 has an even sharper point about how those kind of collaboration through the investment relation, okay, could actually make startups benefit from this process, okay? And what he does is the following. He makes the following idea, which is when the startup innovation may replace the incumbent's existing product. For example, my ice cream might replace the ones from CNC Group. By allowing CVC to invest in me, therefore own a equity share in my startup, okay, I essentially deter the incumbents to enter to come and compete with me, okay? What does it mean? Let's use this ice cream example back, okay? If CNC VC gets 10% of all Song's profit from selling this zero-calorie ice cream, that lowers their incentive to come to compete with me on this zero-calorie ice cream market. Because if they come to compete with me, they're eroding their own market share, they're eroding their own market profits as well, okay? So this is the idea of why it is seemingly counterintuitive that the competitors are making investment in their future competitors, and startups are accepting money from their from their existing incumbents competitors. But there's all those rationale that can support this equilibrium outcome, okay? And also we have a paper that shows actually CVC not only benefit from the firm, as we said, from Dusnitsky and Linux, they actually also benefit the startup because the technological knowledge, as Hellmann modeled and shown in Cheminar et al. 2014, and the risk tolerance of big firms, as argued in Lerner 2012, okay? But do startups also fund incumbents? This might be a very counterintuitive one because remember, right? We said startups are the one who has financial constraints, okay? They are the ones that do not have a lot of good resources there. But the answer is yes. Through what? Through trade credit, okay? Through trade credit. Startups provide goods while incumbents delay their payment. Why this is a financing relationship? Let's think about the following. Now, I am the supplier of CNC ice cream. I developed this very good product and I send it to CNC to sell. And I provide the good, okay, using my own cost to produce, sell, transfer, and so on, and sell it at the CNC ice cream. And they only pay me back those money after 60 days, 90 days, or 120 days. And over this short period of time, it's a short-term debt that is a debt relation that we're having here. And the small suppliers are actually financing the incumbents through trade credit, okay? And if we believe a lot of the papers that I really like, this is actually the second largest type of financing that the large buyers and large firms are getting, and especially from their small suppliers. And their small suppliers are giving very favorable terms, or they're hurting themselves quite much. There are 3 seminal papers that I'm going to go through fairly quickly. I'm going to go back to the assumption later here. So small firms fund large firms. And the first one that actually documented this is by Klepper, Levin, and Rajan in 2012. And they are the first to actually be able to see all those trade credit contracts and found this puzzling and concerning facts. They find that small and young suppliers provide trade credit to large buyers, and they are also giving the most favorable term. If the supplier's size is the smallest, while the buyer is very big, they are giving them the longest delay, okay, possible for them to actually pay them back. I'm financing, the small ones are financing the large ones in a very aggressive way, okay, in a very aggressive way. Why? Because they argue startups offer a trial period to resolve the uncertainty and the lack of relation, okay, the lack of relation. Now let's go back to the assumption here. The financial constraint and disruptive innovation that motivated CVC and so on and so forth no longer matter. What matters becomes startups are uncertain and incumbents have market power. Because I have this new product of zero-calorie ice cream that I'm selling, and I don't have a track record with the large buyer, they are going to use this information asymmetry as a reason to squeeze money from me or squeeze financing from me. Okay, and trade credit is the way for them to do that. And startups seem to really need this kind of a relationship. Basically, they're eager to finance the big firms in order to get the trade. Why it is the case? If you look at Brenza and Limberman 2017 JF paper, where they use a Chilean experiment, where the Chilean government actually called off those operation of small firms financing the large firms, and then say you cannot finance them over certain days, okay? And then what happens is that the big guys are just stopping buying buying goods from the small startups, okay? Because they feel like it is indeed important for them to actually have those kind of relationships or the incumbents financing the startups in order for the startups to actually get the business from the big people. And but this is certainly going to negatively affect the startup suppliers. This is Murphy and Naroji 2015, and they basically said, well, yes, they need the business, but the fact that you need to finance them has a negative consequence on their corporate investment. And John Noel Barrett and Ramananda 2020 at the Journal of Finance also show there's a similar results, negative results on their labor investment other than investment, okay? So basically, I think this is one of the more novel points that I would like to make, which is startups in the financing interactions with the incumbents could actually go in a way that is very counterintuitive. That is, startups, even though they're financially constrained, because they're so eager to establish themselves, therefore they actually need to finance the big guys using trade credit in order to get the business, okay? So that is the financing relation. I'm going to quickly go through the labor as well as physical capital, and hopefully we have in the next 10 minutes or so. And in the labor, okay, it is actually one of the more well-studied area. I think many of you perhaps read broadly about that. And the startups are more likely to produce disruptive innovation, which is something very good. But startups are also more experimental and uncertain, okay? Therefore, as a worker, I might be attracted to this disruptive innovation angle because it could bring me both satisfaction as well as the upward potential for my monetary compensation. But I also need to trade off the risks of going into startup because they are more experimental and uncertain, okay? So what are the interactions on labor markets? On the labor markets, there are three main topics in this literature, okay? The first topic is flow from incumbents to startups, okay? And then the second is from startups to incumbents. And the third one is the legal barriers, okay? It's the legal barriers that are governing this relation. And then remember, the choice of the worker, okay, result from trading off between the benefit from working for a creative startup, both pecuniary and non-pecuniary, and the risks and the uncertainties associated with starting up. And to set the stage, I think there are several interesting papers that are thinking about how the incumbents and startups are competing on the labor market through the wage dimension. This is an unsettled issue, okay? There often have new data, facts, and approaches that are emerging. Some old papers argue that startups have a wage discount. What it means is basically the non-pecuniary benefit of working for a startup is very high, therefore they're willing to take a wage cut. But there are more recent papers that either argues there's not a wage discount, they argue there's a wage premium, like in King 2018, or Babina et al. 2020 that show there's not a discount, okay? So basically it's unclear who is paying more. Therefore, I think it's not that relevant to really think about the monetary terms, that being the very important one here, okay? And I think that has not been the key discussion of this labor market outcome or choice to begin with. Incumbents to startups, okay? This is the literature that some of them we call the spin-off literature or spin-outs or spawning literature. This is one of the most well-studied labor interactions between startups and incumbents. And the idea is that Song's Ice Cream, like myself as a founder, actually could previously worked in CNC Group, Okay, and the key question people answered in this literature are what motivates people to leave the incumbents and to found or join a startup? Are their experience in incumbent firms helpful? Does that actually hurt the incumbents because a key employee actually left the company? So why do they leave the incumbents to join or found a startup? One of the seminal papers here is Gompers, Lerner, and Sharfstein 2005. They use Venture One data and exploit work history, which is very difficult to get, especially during that period of time. They said actually roughly 40% of in-sample startups are founded by someone who left public firm jobs, okay? Spawning or incumbents firms, people leaving incumbents to join startup is incredibly common. And then they tested two potential views, which are the two important views whenever you want to do a paper like that, in my point of view. I think those two views are summarized extremely well in that paper. The first one is basically learning and forming network when working with incumbents. That is, you work with the incumbents, you learn how things work, you form a network using the resources, and so on. That will lower your entrepreneurial entry barrier cost. And the second view is what we call the large incumbents are unlikely to fund these ideas, could be because large firms are incapable of evaluating or responding, like Ari's point about their internal agency problem, or they're optimally refocusing, or meaning that they just don't want to fund anyone who is peripherally related. And the main finding of the paper is that they supported this learning and forming network view. They find that public firms in Silicon Valley and Massachusetts spawn more, especially if they were once a VC-backed firm, and tightly run, undiversified companies where the agency and bureaucratic problems is less, actually spawn more of the startups because people actually learn more deep and useful knowledge in those kind of companies. Okay, do incumbents experience really help them after they start up? And the Chatterjee 2009 says the answer is yes. He used medical device industry startups and found that spawned startups perform better in terms of raising VC faster and produce more and better innovation. However, the knowledge and experience that are the most useful are not innovation related. It is the market and regulation know-how that they learn from the incumbent firms, okay? This idea also relates to this recent papers about the golden age of entrepreneurship, which argues actually the best age to start is roughly 45 or 42. Why that is related here? The reason is, guess what they did before they were 42 or 45, before they start their own business? They actually learn a lot from working for incumbents, okay? So this labor flow from incumbents to entrepreneurial sector is important because entrepreneurial preparation in incumbent firms are very important for entrepreneurial growth because it both determines quantity as well as quality, depending on what they learn from the incumbent employers. The labor flow could also flow the other way, which is the return to incumbents. There could be involuntary returns, which is the acqui-hires. We see a lot of fuzz about acqui-hire in these days, which you say, oh, this company acquired them for acqui-hire. And I think what's nice about King 2020 is basically to argue acqui-hire often do not work, okay? Because this mismatch, in either because of culture or expertise and so on, actually is followed by a huge turnover of those key employees, and they might leave as soon as they can. This is done using US Census data, so it's a universe of the sample. They could voluntarily return back to work for incumbents, the startup. That is basically me giving up my ice cream shop and go back to the CNC group. Why? When the risks and uncertainty of safety uncertainty of staying in entrepreneurship become too high, workers are more willing to return to incumbents. A recent interesting paper I really like is by Shai Bernstein, Rick Townsend, and Ting Xu in 2020 that they actually use job search data during the COVID pandemic and see that workers now are searching more jobs from incumbents rather than from startups. After controlling for the fact that startups might not be hiring, even conditional on that, the people's search activities are more focusing on the safer incumbents. Okay, I think I need to wrap up pretty quickly, but let me spend 1 minute on a nascent area in this interaction, which is physical capital. There are two papers that I'm aware of that deals with this problem. One is a recent paper that I did with Justin Murphy and Ryan Pratt that talks about the capital reallocation between startups and incumbents, which argues that being able to get used capital from incumbents are important for startups. And also there's this Cookson 2018, which argues that incumbents making aggressive capital investment could be a way to deter entrant from startup, because I kind of bluffed them away. Okay, I kind of bluffed them away by making the incumbents, by making investment in the physical, increase my capacity and so on. So I have roughly 1 or 2 minutes. So I do want to share some of the thoughts on where I see some future research could be done in this area, okay? And I see 3 potential venues. And again, those are my personal opinions, and this could come from my naive thoughts on the literature, but these are my thoughts, okay? The first venue is what I call to go deep in the depth, okay? Which is to understand better the economic frictions that affect different interactions. For example, the regulatory environment, how that actually affect the interactions, and the geographic barriers and agglomeration of local activities, how that might affect the interactions if we know that knowledge spillover is very local, capital reallocation is very local. This urban economic angle is something that I think is very important when you think about anything about interactions. And how about the redeployment of assets over incumbents' failure? Because I think there is a resurgence of firm failures and bankruptcy in the literature. What happens to their labor? What happens to their capital? And how that the retired labor from incumbents will go into the entrepreneur sector, I think is an important question to answer. And the second one is what I call the links, which is a lot of the decisions that I talked about here, like, alliances, CVC, licensing, and so on, most of them are studied very independently. Okay, so the elephant in the room is to actually have a comprehensive framework to really know each of those dimensions, how can they actually work together. There's some ongoing effort by different groups of co-authors trying to rationalize this links, but I think there are definitely a lot of rooms to think about those kind of multiple choices in front of you, how you're going to decide type of questions. And the third venue that I think is to do the trend. Basically, remember, most of the results that we have here are pushed by those 5 assumptions about startups and incumbents. And guess what? If those 5 assumptions change over time, that will actually affect how incumbents and startups are going to interact with each other. If, for example, if we think about the trend about easier financing for startups, more market concentration in the US economy, lowering experimentation costs, and so on and so forth. How those parameter changes in the assumptions could affect how startups and incumbents could interact with each other, and how that will affect growth, and how that will affect business dynamism, it's something I think could be very important as well. So with that, I want to thank you again for all your attention and for giving me the opportunity to present, and thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Song. So Song will be around 10, 15 minutes. If you have any questions, I'll probably allow everybody to unmute themselves at this point. So thanks everyone for coming, and check the website and email list for next week's workshop talk. See you guys next time.